Welcome to The Explainer. You've probably heard that addiction is a choice, right? A kind of moral failing. But what if the real story is about a brain that's been hijacked by its own survival instincts? Today, we're going to dig into the science that's completely rewriting what we thought we knew about addiction. Okay, so let's jump right into the big question. Is it a disease, a learning disorder, or something else entirely? For decades, people have argued back and forth. But what's amazing is that neuroscience is now giving us a much clearer picture. And the answer seems to be, well, a little bit of all three. To really get how the brain can be so completely taken over, we first have to appreciate what a brilliant system it is to begin with. A system designed to keep us alive. And at the very heart of that system is this thing called the reward system. You can think of it as our ancient survival circuit, fine-tuned over millions of years. It uses a chemical messenger, dopamine, to teach the brain what's important, to make sure we repeat the things that keep us and our species going. Now, here's where we bust a huge myth. We always hear dopamine called the pleasure molecule, but that's not quite right. It's not really about feeling good, it's about motivation. Dopamine is the chemical that creates the wanting. It's the brain's way of shouting, hey, that was important, pay attention and do it again. And this is where you can see the hijack happen in real time. Look at these numbers. Eating a fantastic meal might give you a nice 50% bump in dopamine, but a drug like an amphetamine, that can crank it up by over 1,000%. To the brain, a signal that strong feels like the most important survival event it has ever experienced. It literally short-circuits that ancient wiring. So what happens next? Well, that massive, totally unnatural flood of dopamine, it's like it kicks off a hostile takeover of the brain's core operating systems. And we can break this takeover down into three main parts. First, the drug goes after what you could call the brain's go engine, the part that drives our habits and motivation. Then it messes with the misery alarm, which is our stress and emotion center. And finally, it just smashes the brakes, the part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's supposed to control our impulses. And here's the absolute key takeaway. The whole reason for using the drug just flips on its head. In the beginning, sure, it's about feeling good. But as the brain changes, it starts to feel awful when the drug isn't there. So the motivation is no longer about chasing a high. It's about desperately trying to escape a state of deep physical and emotional pain. This table lays out that vicious cycle perfectly. You see, it starts with the binge, driven by that pleasure-seeking part of the brain. But that quickly turns into withdrawal, where the brain is just screaming to escape the pain. And then the prefrontal cortex gets totally overwhelmed by craving, which, of course, leads right back to the beginning of the cycle. Okay, but wait a minute. If these drugs are so powerful, why doesn't every single person who tries them get hooked? It's a great question, and the science shows it comes down to a really complex dance between our biology and our environment. And the numbers here are really telling. The truth is, only about 10 to 20% of people who use a substance actually go on to develop an addiction. So that tells you right there, the drug itself can't be the only part of the story. There have to be other things going on that make some people way more vulnerable to that chemical hijack. Get ready for this number because it is absolutely staggering. This represents a 4,600% increased risk of becoming an IV drug user for someone who's had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences. We're talking about things like abuse, neglect, or serious dysfunction at home. It's a seismic link between early life pain and addiction later on. And that leads us right to this really powerful idea from Dr. Gabor Mate. He suggests we're asking the wrong question. It shouldn't be why the addiction, it should be why the pain. The addiction, in this view, isn't the real problem. It's an attempt to solve the problem of unbearable suffering. It's self-medication for a wound that was there long before the first drug. You know, this idea was tested in this famous, kind of mind-blowing experiment called Rat Park. They put rats in these sad, lonely cages with nothing to do, and guess what? They compulsively drank morphine water until they died. But then they put other rats in a lush social park with friends and toys and good food, and those rats almost completely ignored the same drugged water. It turns out your environment can be a powerful antidote. And it's not just rats. We saw this exact same thing happen with people. During the Vietnam War, about 20% of American soldiers got hooked on heroin. People back home were bracing for a massive crisis. But the crisis never came. An incredible 95% of those soldiers just stopped when they got back home to their families and communities. Change the environment, you can break the addiction. All right, so if the problem is this 3-part brain hijack, then what's the solution? Well, the science of recovery actually gives us a really clear 3-part path forward. For recovery to really work, you've got to attack all three of those fronts. First, you have to stabilize the brain's physical hardware. Second, you got to rewire its cognitive software. And third, you have to rebuild the social network, the one that gives you connection and a sense of purpose. First up, stabilizing the hardware. This is where medications like methadone and buprenorphine come in, and they are genuine lifesavers. They work by quieting down that misery alarm in the brain, which stops the awful withdrawal and dials down the cravings. And the data is just undeniable. This kind of treatment cuts the risk of dying from an overdose by 50% or even more. Okay, next up, rewiring the software. This is all about giving the brain new tools. Therapies like CBT, for example, help beef up the prefrontal cortex, the brain's brakes. There's a technique called playing the tape forward that trains you to think past the urge to the consequences. And then there's mindfulness, which teaches you how to surf the urge, to just sit with the discomfort, to notice it without acting on it, and to teach your brain that, hey, this feeling isn't actually an emergency. And that brings us to the final and maybe the most important piece of the puzzle: rebuilding the network. This quote from Johann Hari just says it all. The opposite of addiction isn't just being sober, it's connection. It's the lesson from Rat Park and from those Vietnam soldiers. What really heals is purpose, community, and real human connection. So where does all this leave us? If we accept the science that addiction is often a predictable biological response to pain, trauma, and deep isolation, it changes everything. It pushes us away from blaming people for their lack of willpower and toward a much bigger, much more important question. How can we, as a society, build our own version of Rat Park? How do we build a world with less pain and more connection for everyone?